but that brought to the surface my doubts, my, in particular, hell and determinism working together. Whoa. And like I said, I just think that God removed his protection for a little bit of time. And that for me was a turning point where I was like, okay, the spiritual realm is very real. And God let me get a little taste of hell. And the best way I can describe it is that I think that God removed his hand of protection over my life for about 4 hours. I went crazy. I can't believe I'm going to say this on air, but
Ruslan.
All right, today I have an amazing guest, someone that I watch regularly on the YouTubes. His channel is called Daily Dose of Wisdom, and we have in the studio, not a remote interview, in the studio with Brandon McGuire.
Howdy.
Howdy, man.
I watch your stuff all the time too, man. So this is a cool moment.
I'm humbled. I love what you do, man. I've been watching you, I'd say about a year-ish, and we hit similar topics. I feel like you hit stuff from like an academic standpoint. Like you're a little more smart than I am in terms of like you're like reference books and stuff. And I feel like I'm just kind of hanging on in terms of some of these deeper philosophical conversations. And so thank you for being here. You came all the way from Florida.
Yes, sir.
You have a crazy story of working for one of the biggest media companies out there, of being an entrepreneur, husband, follower of Jesus, traveling all over the country. And I want to get into all of that with you, and now where you are with Daily Dose of Wisdom and how you've kind of worn so many different hats, and now you're crushing it on YouTube. So we're going to talk about all that.
But now in Daily Dose of Wisdom, I only wear one hat.
You only wear one hat, right? For folks who may not be familiar with your channel, tell us about your channel.
Yeah, like you said, I think I think that we probably both have felt that there is a need for Christians to engage with cultural conversations that are already happening anyway. And people are, taking in more content through their screens than ever before. And so I just think that there's a need for a Christian lens looking into all of these conversations that are happening in culture, especially if it's a conversation like the one that we're about to react to, where it's about God, it's about Jesus, it's about the resurrection. I just think that there, is a need for Christians to help people think from the perspective that we would if we actually believe the Bible is real, basically.
Do you see these conversations happening on bigger and bigger platforms, whether it's Jordan Peterson, whether it's Russell Brand, whether it's a seeming increase in terms of popularity and the type of content we make on YouTube, Christian content growing? Do you see all of this pointing to us being on some sort of cusp of revival and renewal and reinterest into Christianity? There's a lot of folks coming to faith seemingly from clearly the world is bad, the world's evil. If evil exists, therefore God has to be real. And then there's people that are taking the claim seriously, like Russell Brand seems to be taking a claim seriously. Do you think that this is pointing to any sort of revival, or do you think this might be doing more harm than good in terms of a cultural Christianity that's very utilitarian?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think about Justin Brierley, who has recently written that book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief.
Yeah. That's a great book, yeah.
Yeah, and he, it's interesting because a lot of the people that he features, be it Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Jordan Peterson, I think he talks to Tom Holland, there does seem to be an emphasis on the utility of religion within a society.
Yep.
And sort of that idea of like, maybe it's a delusion, but it's a useful delusion. Like there's something about people that need to believe in some sort of higher power. It also kind of reminds me of AA, just that idea, the most generic possible definition of God, right? A higher power. What do we really mean by that? We don't really know. We're not going to define it. It's more comfortable to keep God in the realm of the abstract, but we understand that meaning and morality and things are best explained by this higher power, even if it's super abstract. So I think on one hand, you are seeing a trajectory away from like the new atheists, which were extremely dogmatic about it's all bad, religion is bad, God is bad, Christians in particular are the worst. And I think that is softening into something more like, maybe it's not literally true, but maybe it's somehow functionally helpful. Maybe it is a useful delusion. In terms of your question about revival, I really think that that and I'm sure there's a lot of other things, but I think that one dot that needs to be connected is the same dot that we kind of talked about in the reaction video with Jordan Peterson. It's essentially the greatest journey that a person could take is the 18-inch long journey from the head to the heart.
Oh, that's good.
It's when the ideological gives way to the experiential, and when God is not just a concept or a construct or an idea, but he is known by the individual. And what's so interesting is we can sit here and talk about the moral argument or morality. We can pontificate endlessly. But it's when a person realizes that you and I both, and everyone listening to this, has contributed to the problem of evil. We can be mad at the problem of evil, but have we not contributed to it ourselves? And it's when it becomes relevant, that the resurrection becomes relevant, when you realize, I myself am in a body that will die and decompose. And there's only two possibilities. Either that's it. Either I'm merely food for worms, like Robin Williams said in A Dead Poet Society. That's all that my existence adds up to, is that I would become food for worms, or there's transcendence and there's hope, and justice can really be served to the wrongdoer, and forgiveness can be offered to a wretch like me, who, like I said, has also contributed to the problem of evil. So I think it's God becoming personal, and I think it's the personalization of all of these ideas that will be the impetus for revival. If America sees revival, it's going to be, every revival I think begins on your knees. Revival begins when you recognize that it's the humility to recognize, like, I actually, if this is true, I need it. If Jesus died for my sins, that would be good, because I need my sins to be forgiven. If Jesus rose from the dead, I need it because I desire for life to go on. And and you're telling me that life is abundant, that it's not just a repetitive cycle of reincarnation, but that there's abundant life that is offered to me through the free gift of salvation of Christ. This is starting to get interesting, but it's when it becomes relevant, I think, that the spark of revival can happen.
When it becomes relevant in a personal sense.
Right. When a person
encounter.
realizes that we're not just talking about an ancient text, that we're not just talking about God as a philosophy, but we're saying that if you will open your mindset up to the fact that these things might actually be true, then that means that they are true for you.
Yeah.
If Christ is risen, he is alive and can actually change your life and actually forgive your sins.
Yep.
Because if he rose from the dead, then that means that he actually has the power to forgive sins. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Wait a second. I have sins.
Yeah, that's good.
Can you take away my sins? Por favor?
I think the interesting part that I think about is the faith aspect. I've heard it defined as like faith is a confidence spectrum. I'm more confident than not that Jesus bodily rose from the grave. I think the certainty that Luke writes about, right? I'm writing these things so you be certain of them. I think the certainty for us comes into applying said faith, placing my confidence in Jesus, his bodily work, receiving his work on the cross and the forgiveness of my sins, and then leaning into the practice of faith, not as a way to prove my faith, but as a way to save myself, not as a way to save myself, not as a way to earn my favor with God, but as a way to rightfully respond and then practice my faith. And I think the certainty comes on the other side of that. I read my Bible, go to church, love my enemies, right? Do unto others. I do these things. And then the more I do these things, the more I see the hand of God and the fingerprint in living his ways.
I love that.
Right? And I think I would be curious your thought. Like, I always tell people, like, okay, you're not sure about the resurrection. You're not sure about this. Go pretend to be a Christian for a year and see what happens. And just if you have enough slither of hope to go into a community, place your faith in Jesus, the work on the cross is true, and believe it and walk it out for a year. Generally speaking, I think what happens is people go, wait a minute, And so, like, I've seen people get converted, close people, that just come around. They just come around and just hang out. And then they go to church because we're going to church. And they're not sure about church, but they're going to church anyway. And then they go to Bible study. And then they start reading their Bible. And then 6 months into it, they want to pray for the food before we have dinner. And then before you know it, they're then leading a Bible study. And there's almost no like moment of conversion as much as there's an embracement of the fruit of the faith, and then the fruit of the faith points him to the root of the faith, right?
So good.
And so when I think a lot about the issues that I see young men, young Christian men, young men in general having, is a lack of practice of faith. Like I was talking to my therapist today, and he said, how do you do with confession? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I confess my sins to God. And he's like, well, it's like I've been going back and reading a lot of the early church fathers, something about Jerome. And he said it's a practice of confession. They had a practice of regularly coming together and confessing their sins. And that becomes something that's very important. And I was like, man, when do we carve out time to confess our sins to a person?
And be healed.
And be healed.
Yeah.
Right? When do we? And so I think and again, what I'm not saying is we need to do to be saved. What I am saying is the practice of our faith, I think, is extremely helpful to the watching world. And I think it's transformative. And I think it brings goodness and ushers beauty into the world and cares for the widow and the orphan and the least of these. And so as I'm looking at the train, I just see this gap between the things we know to be true. The practice of them in our personal life is lacking. I don't know if it's just Protestant streams or what is it, right? And then the addition of goodness and beauty and effort to make the world better. We don't, I'm speaking in generalities, but we don't always see practiced, What do you make of all that?
I was trying to think of an analogy to explain this idea to people who are not Christians, and I'll tell you the analogy that I came up with, and then I think you'll see why it's not that good. And then I realized that there's a better one that already existed. So what I came up with was, picture two guys are on a boat in the ocean, and they have their scuba gear there. But from the vantage point of being in the boat, all that you can see is dark water and the reflection of the sky above. But the one person says to the other person, I've done this before, and I'm telling you that beneath that dark water is a whole reef with coral and fish, and it's amazing. And we can actually use the scuba gear and go down there and actually enter into like a totally different reality. And it's amazing. It's like one of the most fun experiences ever. It feels like you're flying. There's beauty. It's awesome. And the other guy goes, no, there's no evidence for what you're describing. All that I see is dark water and the reflection of the sky above. And it's this idea that in order to see and experience, you actually have to take that leap of faith to go sort of beneath the water and then to enter into that reality, which I think is kind of what you're describing. It's sort of like it's the old question of, is seeing believing, or is believing seeing? Or as it was put in the Brothers Karamazov, does faith come from miracles, or does miracles come from faith? But there's some problems with that analogy. An even better one, or a more familiar one to people, I think, is the Matrix. It's the idea of the red pill. It's the idea of there's two realities available to you. And when you ingest the red pill, then you enter into a different reality. And this is, I really think that all of these things are getting at what is right in the heart of the New Testament, which is what Jesus is saying: seek me and you will find me if you seek me with all your heart. Knock and the door will be open. All of those types of things that he's saying he's saying, come at me, take a step.
Come at me, bro.
I was about to say that. I was like, I don't know if that's like sacred, but yeah, like come unto me, all ye who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. But there is this divine ask that is made by God to humanity for us to step into him, for us to take the red pill, for us to take the plunge, and in order to get down to that reef, you have to leave the boat and you have to see, although there is some dark and scary water in between you and ultimate reality, you won't really be able to see it fully unless you partake, taste and see that the Lord is good, right? So I don't know, all of that I think is getting at the idea that you're saying, which is that we can, from the vantage point of being on the boat, or from the vantage point of being in the room and just looking at the two pills, the red and the blue pill, we can argue and say, no, there really is this thing, I promise it's there, and we can like pontificate, but there's something about taste and see that the Lord is good. Actually, like you said, begin to put it to practice, begin to obey, begin to repent, begin to just seek the face of God and just see what happens.
Yeah, that's so good. So tell me, in terms of your story and getting to this current destination of making videos and impacting people on the internet, people may know that, but they may not know a whole lot about you personally and how you got here, and how some of this has been a byproduct of your practice of faith, right? You've worked for a massive media company that many people would know, where they're going to remain nameless for this interview. You've traveled and you're married. So like, give me a bit more context on how you got here to where you started, and what was that journey like?
Through a spiritual lens?
Yeah, I mean both.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess the reason that I'm always trying to draw a distinction between having good ideas about God or true, theology, as compared with knowing God, is because from, let's call it 6 until around 19, I feel like I was mostly in that first camp where I was raised in a Christian home.
Okay.
I, went to a Christian high school and sort of was getting my theology screwed on nice and straight. And I'm not saying anything against truth or anything against theology, but it really wasn't that personal. And I would not really say that I was daily walking with God at that point in my life. And we'll leave it at that. And then at some point, though, I feel like that creates cognitive dissonance. And for me, it was there. Actually, funny enough, there's this artist. I'm curious if you know David Bazan, formerly Pedro the Lion.
No.
Christian artist who was like one of the first to deconstruct.
Okay.
And he had this album that was basically like a breakup letter with God. And that album articulated so many of the things that I was going through and thinking at the time. If you knew this would happen and made us just the same, then you, my Lord, can take the blame. Did you push us when we fell? All of these ideas that he communicated in a really beautiful, poetic way, but that brought to the surface my doubts, in particular, hell and determinism working together. Whoa. What's going on here?
Were you raised in a Christian home?
Yeah.
Did you have a more Calvinistic leaning? Okay. Yeah, that's...
Yeah, and I
very common.
Yeah.
Not the Christian home part, the Calvinistic leaning. If you have a deterministic view of hell, that's a really dark abyss to stare at.
It became very difficult to see how God could be good, loving, and powerful in light of eternal conscious torment and determinism. That was a very...
those three together don't make a lot of sense.
The math wasn't math, and very much for me. And again, I would still consider myself reformed in a great many ways. But some of how all that, the place that all of that together brought me to was a very dark place where I really questioned, it's funny, first the goodness of God and then the reality of God. And I think there's something about that that's very, very relevant.
The connection of there. So would you say now you still hold, not necessarily to the same soteriology, right, that ultimately God does the saving, which some people still hold to, but would you say you still hold to the idea of double predestination, that God damns people to hell and saves people?
My channel is very, very pointedly aiming at mere Christianity.
Aha! I like it. I like that answer. You could tell me off the record. No, that's a good.
I just think that the church has notoriously divided over all of these secondary and tertiary issues. And obviously I have my own theology, but I really think that in this moment in culture, it's so important to aim toward unity. Again, we should start a side like theology podcast, whatever. But the point is this, is that God is, I came around through, so I wrestled for about 2 years. I doubted for about 2 years. I put everything on the table and really, like, howling at the moon, long walks on the beach, all by myself. I don't get a God, sometimes even cursing God, just getting to a really dark...
This is from 19?
This is like my first year and a half of college.
Okay.
Thankfully, I was, by God's grace, surrounded by really legit people at that point, both professors who I could ask hard questions to, and then also like friends around me that were like, oh, I dealt with that years ago or whatever. And basically just kind of this whole thing. But it really ended with just God himself, just as a process, kind of like you said, not necessarily, I could circle the date on the calendar when it all clicked, but really God as a process, just walking me through a lot of the stuff and getting me out to the other side where it's like, okay, I'm all in on this. This is real. And it's weird because I know that I have a more emotive personality, and I know that. And I know that God doesn't work the same way with everybody, but God, and I don't know how else to say this without sounding woo-woo, but God has revealed himself to me in a way that is now undeniable for me. He has just met with me enough times, encountered me enough times, and allowed me to experience his presence to where it's not, and again, I'm not diminishing the role of truth at all, but I'm just trying to say, for me, it is no longer just a set of propositions. It is a person who is my friend and who I love.
Yeah.
And
was that on the tail end of something miraculous happening, of some sort of spiritual encounter? Like what happened that made you feel that way?
a lot of different experiences, in worship, in prayer, alone with people, whatever. There was one dark night of the soul that I went through where I cursed God and I said, I don't believe that you're real at all. I don't think that there's any supernatural realm. I don't think any of this is real at all. And the best way I can describe it is that I think that God removed his hand of protection over my life for about 4 hours. I went crazy. I can't believe I'm going to say this on air, but I peed my pants. I climbed a tree. I punched an 8-inch deep hole in the ground. That tree, when I touched it, and I wasn't taking drugs. This story is going to sound crazy, but I touched this tree and 100 birds flew out of it and splattered into the building next to me.
Whoa.
I mean, it was the most demonic, and I don't believe that Christians can be possessed, but I was extremely afflicted in this moment. And like I said, I just think that God removed his protection for a little bit of time. This was during college. This was now 4 a.m. This was after me having a long conversation of doubt and all these things and just vocalizing like really bad things into the air. And then finally alone, pretty much cursing God. This goes on for, like I said, about 4 hours. That was at midnight. And then at around 4 a.m., God wakes my roommate up out of a dead sleep and basically tells him, Brandon is in trouble. You need to go to Brandon. And he walks, we kind of looked at the map of the campus and whatever, and I was over half a mile away from him. And he beelined it to me and found me there like Nebuchadnezzar, just out of my mind, like an animal, just not in a good place. And he prayed for me, prayed over me, however you want to put it. The storm gentled. I like came back to my senses. And that night ended with worship. That night ended with a cappella. Our God isn't awesome. God, and just this really sweet moment. And that for me was a turning point where I was like, okay, the spiritual realm is very real. And God let me get a little taste of hell in order to kind of snap me to my senses and stop playing around with what I was playing around with.
So you're experiencing a darkness based on the things you're saying, the questions you're having, and the way you're processing these questions, while at the same time saying there's no spiritual realm, experiencing the darkness of the spiritual realm, and at the same time God is showing up in a supernatural way to your buddy in a dream and telling him, you need to go find Brandon.
Yeah.
And he goes finds you.
Yep.
On campus.
Yep.
Where were you going to school at the time?
Where?
Yeah, like
Palm Beach Atlantic University.
Okay, and what were you studying?
I was triple studying film, English, and psychology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Triple major?
Double major with a minor. It was psych and film, and then English minor.
Wow. Okay. So what happens after you finish college, and how do you go from all of that, and then you transition to working for a couple of media companies, and then
okay, so the quick plot points is from about the time of that story on, I was like, it was a real big transformation happened, and it was cool because God gave me a hunger and thirst for scripture, and all of a sudden I was like, okay, I'm not on the fence, I'm not doubting that, like I'm all in basically. So if this is what reality is really about, then let's go. And so right after I graduated college, I went on a 3-month-long missions trip to Africa. And that's where a lot of the supernatural stuff happened too. I could talk a lot of stories about that. That could take up hours. But basically, God, the finger of God is just amazing, and the miraculous is real. And God is doing things right now in America too. But you really, for some reason there, I don't know what it is, but you just see his handiwork in the miraculous in really, really cool ways. And so I just experienced dozens of things that it's just like, this is ridiculous. There's like, this is undeniable. And then I was on the spiritual mountaintop of my life coming back from Africa, because you see all that, you're around these people. We did nothing but live out the book of Acts for 90 days. It was awesome. I was with people from all different nations. We all got together and created this team, people from literally Jamaica, Finland, Mozambique, just making this amazing collective of people just like on this mission. And so I was on the spiritual mountaintop of my life coming out of that. And I came back and I'm just talking to people in America on the streets. I'm like, guys, listen, like, I know you guys want to debate about ideas, but I'm telling you, God is 100% real. And let me tell you the story. And I started to like realize that there is a paradigm in the American consciousness that there is something being believed that makes the things that I'm saying unbelievable. And I became very curious about that question. What do you believe about reality that makes what I'm saying so unbelievable? That question led into the documentary film that I made called Mining for God. So I spent 2 years then taking the street interviews and these questions, and then going to William Lane Craig and Lee Strobel and Gary Habermas and trying to answer that question. What are these big obstacles in the American consciousness that block people from being able to rightly understand Christianity? So all of that turned into a documentary film that I made, which then kind of started the like path toward the idea of like production and content and whatever. That film was not super successful, financially or whatever.
Wait, is it on YouTube still?
I'm actually depending on when we release this, I'm actually going to be offering it for free for the first time since it was made. There's a long story that is not really relevant as to why that is the case. But yeah, so it's basically going to be free in the very near future.
Okay. So it's not publicly out yet.
No.
Okay.
And so, well, it's actually on Vimeo right now, but it'll be, I'm making it available for free, basically. And so anyways, then I met my wife and had to pivot into like putting food on the table and all of that. And then, like you mentioned, the big media company that I worked for, and it kind of came around to a point where it just became clear. It's like, man, I think that I have this like desire to use content and media and the things that I've learned about that for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, and it's not going away. And I think at some point it was just like, I need to quit everything and just go.
It's a dream job.
The job that I had was a dream job.
Yeah. Well, for one of the biggest creators out there.
Yeah, I know. And it was one of those
and
things.
You walked away from it.
I walked away. Yeah. And I did feel a sense of, is this stupid? Am I just like high in the sky, or like, why am I like, is this a good choice? And very much aware there's 100 people behind you in line. Like, but yeah, I wrestled with that for about 3 months. I prayed and fasted for 1 week. And on the Thursday of that week, I got a call from a friend whose brother is another creator and was looking for a producer. And that became, to me, like the clarity that I needed. I was already 90% there, but that was, and the fact that it happened during that week where I was really looking for an answer, that became the clarity that I needed to go ahead and quit that job, and then to kind of go into a more casual type of thing in order to then also kind of begin working, or not in order to, but it ended up being the case that through that job, I had a little bit more time to start to think about this type of content.
And Daily Dose of Wisdom is launched after you quit the job and fully take the plunge over, or were you already kind of dabbling? Where were you at with everything?
No, I wasn't doing, I wasn't allowed to do, nor was I doing any content for Daily Dose of Wisdom while I was employed by this bigger company.
Like that was in the contract. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
So then you transition off, and then how long from when you transition off to when you actually start the YouTube?
Well, it's funny, I don't know if your experience was different with this or not, but for me, everything was very much of just an experiment. So it wasn't like I'm going all in. It was more of like, oh, you see some video on YouTube and you're like, oh, I have thoughts about that, and you kind of just kind of do it, but it's and then you release that, and it's like, oh, nothing really happened with that. So there wasn't like a immediate start date. It was more of like, I have some space in my life, some time now to where I can, I don't know, I have the bandwidth to actually think about things that I'm watching naturally. And then I just started saying, you know what, let me just kind of literally the first couple videos was just with an iPhone. It's like play the video on an iPhone. Yeah. So, here's some of my thoughts about this, whatever. So it kind of started like that. And then at some point I was like thinking, I should probably be a little bit more organized or intentional about it. And then I don't know the exact timeline, but somewhere along the way it was, started going well. And then it was very cool as well because that second job that I mentioned ended up having a clear end to it from the person who hired me for a number of other reasons, zero bad blood, but it just became obvious that there was going to be a parting of ways. But throughout that period of time, God had kind of been providing and building up the Daily Dose of Wisdom thing so that about 4 months ago now that ended and it then became clear, okay, I guess I'm going to do this full time.
Working for a big media company, get a call, hey, I got a project. There's a producer, also creative job. You get away from the big media company. Now you have some freedom to make your own videos while you're working this other big project. And then as that's sunsetting, Daily Dose of Wisdom is revving up, or when you quit that other job, then you really went all in and it revved up and blew up.
I would say the first of those two options. It was like I said, I'm doing that job about 40 hours a week, but with the extra 10 hours a week, I was just consistently putting out a video or maybe 2 per week. And then some of those videos started to do well. And then at some point when that person was kind of gave me the call, we're no longer in need of your services. Luckily, thank God, it wasn't like, great, I'm homeless. It was like, there's a pretty clear path to where I should go from here.
Yeah, well, I love that aspect about your story because it's a very responsible way to become a YouTuber. And I think a lot of people just want to jump out the window and just go all out without having understanding of what they're even going to talk about, 2, having a way to sustain themselves while they're trying to get this YouTube business off the ground, and 3, having the transition of income and stability as you're making the jump, right? Dave Ramsey always talks about before you make the leap, you got to make sure the ship is close enough to the dock. Because if the ship's not close enough to the dock for you to jump and become an entrepreneur, you will jump off the ship and hit the wall. And there'll be blood and guts and tears. And it's very painful.
Or you're gonna go scuba diving in a bad way.
Yeah. So it's cool to hear you talk about how like it was more of a slow transition, and then you finally made that plunge. You said about 4 months ago.
Yep. Yeah, about 4 months ago. And it's funny because we were talking about this off camera, but a lot of the little things that you should do to become more systematic about everything or more efficient or to, distribute labor in a way that allows you to do more volume or whatever. I haven't done a lot of those things. It's just been a one-man show and it's been great, but just, maybe it's just the season that I need just to exercise the muscles of doing it and just becoming more comfortable in front of the camera or whatever. But up until this point, I've basically just been doing the same thing that I have done from the very beginning, but just in a bit more consistent manner, but still by myself.
Yeah. What would you say is the ultimate hope of what you're doing with Daily Dose of Wisdom and where you want to take your viewer to? Like, what would you say is is it just having interesting conversations that you find interesting? Like, what would you say the North Star is?
It's a really good question. What I will say is I don't have a 10-year plan that's fixed and I'm aiming at rolling out. I'm surprised with suddenly having a decent audience. And I am asking myself that exact question of how do I best steward this audience? And I am convinced that simply ingesting content cannot be the entire thing. And so I'm starting to think about creating community within that, creating a space where, because I get a lot of emails from people who have tough questions or who are working through some doubt or are seeking. And right now it's responding to those emails, one at a time. And so I'm really thinking about how best to, create a space where those types of conversations can be facilitated, and where you can have a judgment-free zone where it's like, it's okay to ask questions. Doubt is not bad. And doubt, when dealt with properly, will give way to deeper faith. That's what I experienced, and that's what I really believe. And questions should not be shied away from. They should be leaned into, because at the bottom of every question is a brilliant answer, I believe, because God is not a trickster. And so that is what I'm starting to think about, is how to offer more value, to this YouTube audience beyond just another piece of content, but to connect, how to connect with these people who are emailing me these big questions in a better manner than just, a 20 paragraph long email.
Yeah,
Here's my life story and all my questions, doubts, and concerns. It's like, man, I want to help this person. This is real stuff. You can't just leave this unread. This is like serious. This is this person's life. But at the same time, I, as an individual, don't have the bandwidth to write a essay response to every individual email. So just figuring out how to best kind of steward all that.
Yeah, that's good. I think community is obviously the pathway forward. I think creating spaces for people to come together, I think, is very, very helpful in person. Like, I think so much of the internet's great, but I think, like, man, if we can get people in the room, and then preferably from just in the room to doing life with other people, I think is super helpful. Before you did the creative stuff on your own, you said you told me off camera that you ran a business, which I also think contributes to where you're at now. Tell me a little bit about the type of business you ran, which is totally not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
And what would you say some of those lessons were that you had in terms of the stuff you don't want to do, and how it prepared you for the stuff you are doing now?
Yeah. So this was right when COVID hit. So I had, like, between the documentary and the business that I'm about to talk about, I had done basically freelance videography and, weddings and videos for businesses and stuff like that. But when COVID hit, that took a huge hit, because people didn't want someone coming in to their place anymore. People didn't have the same budget that they had. It was
even in Florida.
Even in Florida, yeah. DeSantis, yeah. Even in Florida, it was literally 80% drop in everything across the board within a few month period. It was just like boom.
Yeah.
Retainer clients all of a sudden no longer. So
horrifying.
It was clear that I needed to make a pivot.
Yeah.
Making a long story short, I had a buddy whose dad owned a franchise of home healthcare agencies.
Okay.
Through conversations with him, he started telling me more about it, this and that. It costs this much to buy the whole, business in a box. And, we'll help you with the legal side, the paperwork, the software, the training, the this and that. So my wife and I talked about it, and I was like, you know what? Desperate times. This doesn't feel super in alignment with everything else that my life has been about. But like I said, we're trying to get pregnant, and let's just do it. So I did that, and it actually went well from a business perspective, but it was also a really good lesson for me in where if your only motive is money, at least for me and my personality, you can very quickly realize that whatever dollar amount you're getting is just not worth it.
Yep.
This was the type of job where I was getting phone calls at 2 a.m. People are calling out. There's like legal threats on the horizon because of a medication that wasn't managed properly because of this. There was just all of these situations that were going on. And the entire job is basically like damage control, crisis management, and getting chewed out by my clients.
Yeah.
And just like I said, a schedule that's totally unpredictable. Now, I have to say this. I have the utmost respect for people that do this.
Yeah.
I know that other people can manage all this better than me. People create teams where they bifurcate, that role into different positions, and they actually are able to make it work. So I'm not trying to dump on the whole industry.
Yeah.
I'm merely describing that for me, it was a disaster.
How long did you do that for?
1 year.
And how successful was it?
It was very successful.
Yeah. So financially, it's very successful. But
Yeah.
your soul is getting zapped.
Yes.
Despite the money being good.
Yes. And I also ran into problems too where, like, how do I say this? Yeah. So the clients are these old. It's a family who's it's very personal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a family where the mom has dementia and she needs assistance throughout her day. But the amount of money that the family has to pay for is not always the same as the level of care that she needs. Then you have, on the other hand, a caregiver who might just be an amazing person and who is working 50, 60, 70 hours a week because she's a single mom and she's trying to pay for her kids and her family. So you get into this situation where if you have compassion, it gets really, really hard to run this business because you want to offer them the hours that they need but cannot afford. You want to pay the caregiver the amount of money that they need, and all of a sudden your business model just gets squeezed into where like that gap can entirely close. And you can literally there were several different cases or whatever you want to call them. I guess you would call them cases where I, as the agency, was making $0.
You weren't even breaking.
And there was some where I was losing money, but I was offering care to a family that I knew they wouldn't have been able to get it in any other manner.
Yeah.
So that was the problem was for me. It was too personal. It was too close to home. And I was just too much like, I know this woman and she needs it. And I know this caregiver and she needs it. And
she needs the hours. She needs the services. I'll reduce my margins.
Yeah.
So that these people can.
And I had friends who were doing this, or I got to know some of the other owners, and everyone's like, "You're terrible at this. You increase the hourly rate there, and keep the caregiver price the same, and so that you have some skin in the game, man." So, anyways, without going too much into that, it just for me was a bad fit. It was too personal. It was too close to home. Yeah, just not a good fit at any level, and extremely stressful.
So it sounds like the lesson you learned was one: don't just do stuff if it's financially successful.
That's the bottom line. Is I think that it is a mistake to not consider and not to talk through with God. Who am I?
Yeah.
How have you made me? What are my gifts? What are my talents? What are my interests? And what type of plow should I be putting my hand to?
That's
God.
Good. That's
rather
good.
than where's the money. So
don't do it just for the money. 2, do it with a certain degree of your own interest and wiring and passions. Because if the money is bad, but at least you have skin in the game in the sense that you're interested and passionate about what you're doing. And by passionate, I don't mean like you have good feelings towards the work. I mean passionate in the sense of the Jesus word of passion. You're willing to suffer for this cause. I feel like doing something like that when the money's not there over time, not always, but can eventually the profits will come. Eventually the thing will turn around if you're deliberate and you're intentional and you're educated. So it sounds like that's another one. It's like, don't just do stuff that you're not interested in. And then what would you say from that experience prepared you into what you're doing now as a solopreneur on YouTube?
Well, for one, it gave me a contrast that I'm forever in debt to, because I'll always have that marker of how miserable I can be doing something. And even on a hard day of doing whatever, it will never be as hard as that, I don't think. And so it has offered me that valuable contrast that I'm grateful for. Also, it made me way more organized, systematic. It basically forced me to grow up in a lot of ways. You mentioned how you're an artist, you're a creative, and I don't know obviously all the idiosyncrasies of your personality, but the stereotype is that we can sometimes be more willy-nilly about how we do things. It's not always true, but it is kind of true with me. I'm usually the person who's not keeping track of I'm not counting every bean, and that job basically forces you to, or else you're gonna get sued. You have to
attention to detail.
You have to.
Yeah.
You literally have to know everything that's going on. And so, I think in that sense it was good. It was the school of hard knocks for me. It was like boot camp, and I think God used it, like I said, psychologically to give me a reference point that makes me more grateful for everything post it. And I think also it was a time of equipping.
Interesting. Okay. What any other transferable wisdom you would have from that situation that you would give to aspiring creators that perhaps they're in that season. Perhaps they're in a season that the money's not even good. They're just in a season of suffering. They just got to suffer. They're fresh out of college, maybe they're fresh out of high school.
Yeah.
And school hard knocks, and they're like, man, I see what you're doing. I see what Ruslan's doing. I'd love to do something similar. What advice would you have for them from that?
I think that people, and this is cliche, but it's very true, people don't look at the roadmap that anyone has gone through to get to the place that they want to be at. And the reality is, it's very rarely that you go from 0 to 100. Usually behind the curtain is a long story of trial and error and mistakes and lessons and things that in a painful, arduous, long format way are then slowly implemented into the recipe for success. People see success and they think that it comes overnight, but I mean, my story, like I said, is definitely not linear at all. And I'm not even saying that I, have that much success or whatever, but in the sense of feeling pretty confident that I am where God wants me to be and that I'm using certain skills that he's given me as best as I can for the glory of God. Let's call that success. It's a process and it's a bumpy road. And the biggest thing I would say, I think, is don't be hasty, and at the same time, always be learning, because it really is through knowledge and through, even like we were talking about your setup here, it's ultimately just it's just knowledge that allows things, to work better. So, I would say this as well. If someone's listening to this and has a big dream, but is in the middle of something that is making it impossible to make any kind of progress toward that dream, you might want to reconsider what you're doing. Not saying, like you said, to where the boat is not next to the dock, don't jump too early. But for me, that was when I was working for the big company. I just didn't have any bandwidth to make any progress or to research or have any new knowledge being gained. It was like 100% of my time and energy was dedicated toward that job. And I do think that can be a problem, is when an employer is asking too much from someone, it doesn't leave you any opportunity to even figure out what the next step is or to build into anything else. You're just, you're all in on that thing. And actually that was the same with the home healthcare agency. So there's something about carving out a schedule for yourself where it's like, okay, my bills are paid. I'm doing this. And I know that I have, let's call it like 10 or 15 hours a week on the side that I'm going to intentionally invest into my dream.
I love that. I think for me, so I quit my job full-time in 2015, but I was almost able to go full-time 2011, 2012 doing music. And my job at the time was actually a very fulfilling job. It was very fun to do. And the job gave me life. I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So they were all high functioning. I had a group of 3, pick them up, go to the gym. I get to work out. They get to work out, leave the gym, go to lunch. Then we do a PM activity. Sometimes we'd go walk the pier. Sometimes we'd go to a library. Sometimes we'd go to school.
That's awesome.
Off at 3:00. Not great money, but enough money that I could take care of the bills I needed to take care of. And then also I had 3 to 6 till my wife got home to work on music stuff. And that gave me that stability, but also that margin in the work. So it's interesting to hear you talk about, hey, having margin in your personal life to go after the thing you want to do. Because I always look at it the opposite side. I think you're speaking to a demographic of people that are skilled, hardworking, driven, and are already getting after it. And I always think about the average American who consumes 8 hours of media a day between video games, tablets, TV.
So you're saying they have the time, they're just not spending it.
They're paralyzed from comfort, or they haven't dealt with their issues, or they just don't know any better. They don't have the information of like the compounding effects of, if I spend a little bit of time doing something every day, a year from now, holy moly, I'm in a different spot, right? I think there's a lot of folks that don't know that. There's a lot of folks that don't know that, like, if you walk 10,000 steps a day and you like eat less processed food and more protein, like you'll be in good shape, generally speaking, unless you have a thyroid issue or something, right? Generally. So I think like I'm dealing with a lot of folks that like the practical side, they just don't know. Your story is like, you were a pretty high octane kind of guy. And so I wonder about how many people are where you were at. Like they were getting it. They were educated. They did work hard. They just were too into someone else's business to be able to have margin to build their own.
Well, let me ask you this question, because I've actually been thinking about this recently. You're saying I'm high octane, which is funny because I don't think that I am. And I think I look around at like different like relatives that I have and people that I know, and I'm like, man, I'm such a low performing individual. But I think I know what you mean by that in the sense, and I think one thing that I have, a gift that God has given me is vision. Like having a dream, having something that I believe in, that I want to make happen. And then I think I'm actually, if you were to look at like every 8 hours, it's like, I think I produce less than some other people that I know that I'm just like, geez, how did you do that and that all in one day? This is crazy. But I think when you have vision, you basically over time work toward achieving whatever that thing is that you want to. But this is my question for you is, how do you help someone have vision, I guess? Because some of these younger guys that I'm talking to, they don't really, I don't know how to say it. It's almost like maybe they don't have any, they're just not sure what they're supposed to do. And so they might be in just some sort of job that they don't really like. And it's maybe just barely paying the bills, but they don't have that framework of, I'm doing this as a part of a process to get to where I really want to get to, because they don't really have a vision, I guess, for their future. And it's something I've been thinking about, of, do you just ask people to pray that, God would give them that? But I don't know, but I think a lot of people are struggling with that. Just what are you supposed to do in your few years here on this planet?
Are these guys in church, like these guys in your local church that you're discipling? Okay. So I think people always say carrot versus the stick. I think it's an and both. Like I think there's a and both, meaning this. I think there are times where we need to slow down and just dream, right? So we talked about Financial Peace University, me taking some people through how my local church just did a group. Like how many times do people just get to sit down and dream and go, what would life look like if I was debt free and I had no debt? That's a form of vision. Now we're thinking carrot. Now we're thinking like, if you had no bills, I'm using Financial Peace as a placeholder, right? If I had no bills, if my house was paid for, what would I do? And people usually go to, I would travel.
Right.
Okay, cool. Let's go a little deeper than that. What would you do? Well, then they start getting into, well, I want to help these people do this and da-da-da-da-da, right? So I think I'm asking the young men that I get influence over, like, let's just dream. Let's just imagine a world. Imagine a world where, right? And they start filling in those gaps. So then their imagination starts spinning. I think a lot of people don't have that. Like not because they don't want it, but just maybe they're wired different. Maybe they work hard. Maybe they're distracted. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're sick. They don't have that. They don't have the imagination aspect. So that's the carrot aspect. You got to give them something to hope for. Right. Church does that. I think church kind of calls out the preaching of the word does that, meaning that it reminds you that there's something bigger and greater than you. And then hopefully you can be a conduit in helping the kingdom come to earth, right?
Yep.
The stick is the flip side is like, now what if you just continue on the trajectory you've been on? What if you repeat the cycle of your father? What if you repeat the traumas that you went through? What if you repeat these things? And what happens then? And that's the stick. That's the part that we don't want to talk about. Like, I don't want to be like my dad and my mom and my dad split and bad things happen, right? But I think there's a helpfulness of sitting in that and being like, okay, what if I don't do anything? Who do I become? What if I just fleshed my current trajectory out? And the compounding effect of either positive deposits of good things versus negative deposits or lack of any deposit in the negative things. This is where I think stuff like, this is going to sound crazy, but shame can be good. Like conviction of, I'm just apathetic and lazy, right? Flesh that out over the next 15 years. And who are you when you're 35 if you're still doing nothing, right? So I think it's like exploring both things. And the more I do that with young men, the more they seem to be like, all right, like, let me just grasp onto something. You know, with one of my family members, it's like, bro, you got to stop spending all your money on eating out. Because if you keep spending all your money on that, you're going to keep being broke. And if you keep being broke into your 30s, it's going to be really bad. At some point, you're going to have a kid. You don't want your kid to be broke. You don't want to repeat the cycle, right?
Yeah.
So then we do that, and then we go, what's the goal? The goal is $1,000 emergency fund. And I go, okay, that's a Dave Ramsey $1,000 emergency fund. I have a system I walked him through with the Ramsey stuff. And then the moment he hits that $1,000 emergency fund, boom, I'll match it with you. Here's another $1,000 in your Cash App. And he's like, whoa, like that's crazy, right? So now there's that positive momentum, and we have a good grasp of the negative momentum as well. So that's kind of what I've been doing with guys on a day-to-day basis is let's dream and imagine, but like let's also have the nightmare scenario and what life looks like if you suck.
Yeah.
You know?
That's good.
And all of it anchored on Jesus and knowing him and making him known is the ultimate North Star. But how do we make him known in our generations? The way it says David had a heart for God in his own generation.
Yeah.
Right? Purpose for God in his own generation. David had a heart for God and God's purpose in his generation. So God has a purpose for all of us, but in our generation.
Yeah.
God gets to define what the purpose is, right? So that's how I've been having that. I'm not sure if that's helpful or not.
No, it is good. And I love your you highlighting at the end of what you said there that we're not talking about building your own kingdom and empire and get rich quick or something like that. Like that's it reminds me of so much content I see on the internet that is aimed at that, because there is a ambition in the heart of man to build something. And I don't think that that's all bad, but I love what you said at the end there, that we're actually talking about how to use the talents, gifts, and resources that we have, and how to be like within the parable of the sower, right? Like how to multiply whatever you've been given in terms of your creativity, in terms of whatever it is, how to use it all to the glory of God, right? Colossians 3:23, like whatever you do,
yes,
in word or in deed, do it all unto the glory of God. And this is interesting too, because I actually think that we need creativity and originality more than, maybe even more than like in the previous generation, just in the sense that I feel like in the previous generation, now I'm talking a little bit explicitly here about like literally evangelism, or how do you, whatever that word means, how do you advance the kingdom in 2024? It's an interesting question, because I think that a lot of people seem to be very disillusioned with anything that's too systematic or formulaic. Evangelism explosion, ABCs, like there's these different things that were widely used in the 90s, and I'm not even saying anything negative against them. I'm just saying that I think people our age, generally speaking, are aware of how some of those things might kind of come across weird. And I think people are really afraid of coming across weird. And I think that there's a baggage around how do I talk about God in the world without that being weird? And I think, I don't know, and I think that fear has caused a huge deficit in people talking about God. The one thing you're not supposed to talk about is God, in politics. Yeah. But I'm sitting here thinking, I mean, we just looked at Jordan Peterson and Alex O'Connor talk about God in the Bible for 2.5 hours. So my point is the conversations are happening. And I personally think that the need is as great as it's ever been for Christians to not be ashamed of the gospel of Christ, and to pray like that Acts chapter 4 prayer, give us courage and boldness, and also obviously wisdom. These are all things that we can pray for, that God can give us. But I just think that there's a vacuum in culture and a huge need for Christians to lean into conversations about God and to help people connect dots, because there's obviously this meaning crisis. In many ways, we're in this post-truth culture. And yet I look around and it seems like Christians are shy, and Christians are afraid to talk about what we believe. So I don't know. But again, how do we do it? What's the right mechanism, if you will, to do that? I think that I don't know. I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but I think the arts, creativity, story, these different things.
I think it's on both. I think it's the arts, creativity, narrative, story, media, technology, all the things that we know we could be doing. But I also think there's an aspect of deal with your junk. I'm coming from a perspective of like a lot of brokenness, a lot of broken families, a lot of divorced folks, right? And so I think sometimes people just need to see that, like, bro, just like show me you love your wife, like show me Show me you're a functioning, stable human
Yeah.
that God has actually restored and did a supernatural work on, and you are changing the trajectory of your family tree.
That's good.
Right. And I think like the supernatural aspect in the hand of God that like left to my own devices without Jesus, like I'm a pretty terrible human. But because of Jesus, I'm able to be a husband and a father and a friend and a boss and an entrepreneur and take care of people and treat people well. Sometimes I think so much of that is more caught than taught. So we could teach all of the things. We could teach all the right FAQs, but I guess this is to bring the whole conversation full circle. This is why I'm empathetic with Jordan Peterson when he goes, "Well, what does that mean? What does that mean?" That could be very difficult for someone that's coming from I've come from a middle class life. I've been stable for a long time. I don't have any existential crisis. It's very different when you're coming from generational trauma, baggage, just terrible things you've gone through, your parents have gone through, and you're trying to figure out how to turn that and go in a different direction. And do it for the sake of the least of these. Meaning I'm empathetic to the people who have gone to prison because my closest friends have gone to prison and been decades in prison. So when Jesus says, when I was in prison, you visited me, like, oh, that hits. Because I know what it's like to carve out. Because in order to go visit somebody in prison, you got to have flexibility in your schedule. You got to have resources. You got to have means. You got to have, like, on my Saturday can be dedicated to going and seeing my buddy who's in jail, right? That requires a degree of flexibility to clothe someone, to feed someone, to take care of people. So you got to first be stable to do that for other people. And I think there's a lot of people that aren't stable. There's a lot of people that are hurting because of a meaning. And so that's why I kind of always lean into the practical side, because that's what did it for me. Like I walked with Jesus, went to church for like a decade and was still a mess and addicted to porn and struggling and emotionally stunted. And then the more I started applying the wisdom of God, the Proverbs, the Matthew 25, parable of the talents, the Luke 16, the more like the needle started moving, and I started actually moving towards those things that I believe God had showed me that I was going to do, like I'm doing now. And it was theology and practice, right? Theology, praxology for the sake of doxology, right? Belief in action for the sake of God's glory.
Yeah.
That's my heart.
I love that too, because I think that the idea of a platform can honestly be really silly in the sense that it can create this idea that that's somehow better than not having a platform. And I'm not really convinced that that's true. I think that it's just a matter of what is God intending to do for a certain person. And it's not necessarily, I just think about us both having a platform. This is such almost a secular idea, but that doesn't necessarily glorify God any more than the person who just really loves their neighbor really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, or the responsibility and the weight there that comes with having a platform. Just the like, this is holy to be able to be a public Christian in society and to say the things we get to say. Like, that's not light. Like, that's a weight that we carry.
Yeah.
That comes with different complications. Now, it's also an incredible privilege, but it comes with different complications. And I think you're totally right. Like, life is a lot simpler for the person that can live a quiet life unto the glory of God. Right?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about, some of these examples in the New Testament where it's like the widow's mite. It's like, is that a better or a worse act of worship? Well, it was less money, but it was apparently a better act of worship. It moved the needle less in some practical sense. It didn't help the cause as much practically, but Christ looks at it and says, she gets it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
because of what she was willing to give and the heart that she had toward what she did. So I guess that's what I'm saying is, I just don't want to create this illusion for people that like the goal is everyone should have a platform. I'm not convinced of that at all.
I'm not either. And I'm 100% with you. And I think, but what I am convinced of is everyone should be faithful to whatever they've been given, the time, talent, and treasure. And I've always felt this responsibility of like, I know that God's given me a lot and I just want to honor him with it. And that comes down to the daily decisions I make, the daily non-negotiables. And that is like that comes with a fear and trembling that I am grateful for, you know? So anyway, any final thoughts before we get out of here, brother?
This has just been great, man. I'm loving the studio, loving the conversation. I've even lost track of what segment is going into what thing. As we're going here, I'm like, I think
I lost track of what we talked about before we started recording, and
I'm pretty sure we're on the entrepreneurial channel at this point, but I can't remember when we got there. But no, it's all good. It's awesome to be here.
Word up, man. All right, guys, we're out of here. Peace.
All right, let me know what you think about that in the comments section. And it would be remiss of me to not tell you about our biggest sale of the year, our Father's Day sale happening right now. You can get our brand new Bless God Prayer Journal at the cheapest price it's ever been, as well as some pretty fire priest, provider, protector launch that's perfect for the husband, the father, or the mentor in your life. So go to blessgod.shop and pick up something right now. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.